So welcome to the rendering section of the tutorial. The good news is that we're almost done with the project, and the bad news is that we're almost done with the project. So in this section we're going to be covering a few different things. The scene, including the setting up of the lights, how it's evolved from the texturing section, where we set up the lights, the camera, and the environment. We'll be discussing the materials and how they've changed. We'll be looking at the camera and the certain effects that we have access to. We'll be taking a look at the render region tool, should we want to focus on a certain area rather than doing an entire render of the scene. We'll be looking at the render settings, and I'll be sharing with you the settings that I've had some success with in working on similar projects like this one. And then finally we'll be having a look at the render outputs, how to set them up, and then we'll be discussing the strategies for using them in post-production should we want to do that. So with that said, let's jump into the rendering and complete our project. Alright, so coming into the rendering section, we're really a step ahead of the game because a lot of the things that we have in place in the scene we've already done the work for. Remember when back in the texturing section we had to set up some lights so that we can have just kind of a good evaluation of what the textures are going to look like. Without light, texturing the model is just impossible. A lot of the things that we have are still there. We'll talk about some of the differences and what's been added and what's been altered. So the first thing we should talk about is this ground material. And if you remember in the texturing section, we assigned a shadow catcher. And that's fine as a starting point, but the more that I worked with the render, I really was missing the ground here. I wanted to have some reflection going and just a nice little shadow. So we took that out. Let's just take a look at that material. And it's white, but I turned the diffuse down a little bit lower so that we're getting a little bit more shadow down here. It does have some reflection to it and some Fresnel. We're getting some of this reflective, some of her boots reflected down here. Just kind of a nice little effect. I think it works pretty well. Blurry reflections, and it has a little bit of roughness. So it's just a nice subtle little anchor to the scene. I think that works pretty well. Alright, so moving on to the lights. Now whenever I'm working with a scene that's got a lot of different lights going on, it's really hard to differentiate what's lighting what. So the way that I like to work it is to sort of isolate individual lights just to see what kind of effect they're having on the model. So let's take a look at that. The first light I want to take a look at is this key light. So if I have it selected, I'm just going to pause the render and pause preview. I'm going to leave the ground on. Let's just have a quick look at our environments. I'm going to turn I just have a black constant down here. And that's basically just going to override everything that's in the scene in terms of this gray material that we started with. Now with that done, I'm just going to start up the preview again. And by working this way, and you can see that as preview starts to update, we have a really good sense of what the light is responsible for. Now I've repositioned this key light on her and I shifted it over a little bit. Let me just get a good vantage point. Initially it was a little closer, it was a little bit more in front. It was flattening her out too much. So I just shifted it over to one side, and what that gained me is the strong shadow that's starting on her face and just extends all the way down her body. Whenever you're lighting a subject, it's important to take an evaluation of the forms and just to sort of arrange those lights to make sure that they're not flattening something out. You're really getting a good representation of what it is that you're lighting. It still retains its form. So shadow is a big part of that equation. So let's take a look at the fill light. Now the fill light, it's a cooler light. You'll see it's going to populate right here. While warm colors advance, cool colors recede. I'll tend to use for a fill light something that's a little bit cooler. Let's just have a look at that material. You can see that it's not changed in terms of color and intensity. It's still that I've moved it over a little bit from where it was. You can tell I've changed the shape of it just by hitting tab. I'm pretty happy with that color, and it really just sort of fills in the areas that I want. I'm still getting some shadow there, and it's not very bright. It's just functioning as a pretty good fill light for that area. Now let's look at the gobo. This gobo light is responsible for illuminating her face. The big key light fills up a lot of her body. It's responsible for illuminating, just most of her body. But I felt like it was not strong enough to light her face. So you can introducing another little light just that's responsible for that. I think that's a pretty good use of that. I think it's a little bit warmer. Let's just take a look at that material. So right now it's a pretty intense light. It is warmer. So let's just take a look at another light. Maybe this bounce card. It's real subtle. So as I had everything in place, the bounce card I added last because it just wasn't, I was missing a little bit of detail to that side. It was just too much shadow. So occasionally I'll just drop in a little bit of a illuminated polygon in certain areas, but you can see how that's working right there. So the last thing that I want to show you is this backlight. It's responsible for it's like a rim light, but it's really strong. So it's really tall, so it's coming down over her head. I think this is a pretty good way to illustrate and a great way to work, especially if you wanted to identify what each light is doing. You can see that the light just sort of spills out over her hair and across her shoulders and onto her chest, and then it's responsible for this really nice line on her hip. That was definitely missing when we were doing our texturing. So all of those lights working together gives us a really good representation of, or it allows us to see the things individually, to see what's hitting what, and so that we can sort of tailor those individual lights to better suit our model. So the last thing that I'll mention regarding the lighting is that we have two different environments working in the scene. One of our environments is responsible for the indirect and reflective rays and is hidden from the camera. You can see I have this environment node selected. It's being driven by this darker gray color. You can see that we have some light on the subject. The other environment that is only responsible for the color of the scene, meaning that there's no light information from that environment that is being shared with the model. You can see that if we come back to select our this dark gray color, and if we wanted to make her a little bit darker, we can just adjust that down, or a little bit lighter, we can adjust that up. So one last thing to mention is that remember that when we had some of our lights selected, we wanted to hide them in the viewport, but we wanted them to render. It's important, especially if you're going to do this workflow of turning lights on and turning lights off, that you make sure that that setting is turned back to its default. So if you have your mesh selected, if you go under mesh, under render, just make sure we shift this back from yes to default, so that if the item is on, it will render, but if the item is off, that it won't. So now with everything back on, you can see that all of these different components working together gives us a nice balance of light on our subject. And I think with that, we're ready to move on. Alright, so let's have a closer look at some of the materials in our model. First off, I want to direct your attention to the preview window we have here. And if you click on the options, you can see that I've got displacements off. Now you remember we have a displacement map on her hair, and I also have added one on her shirt. We're going to take a look at that here in a minute. I wanted to remind you that once you have this camera set up, you make sure that you lock it. Okay, so you select the camera, right click, and just make sure it's locked, because you don't want to bump that camera if you happen to move over here and do some navigating. Now if you have a mouse with a scroll wheel, if you hold the shift key down, you can zoom in and out, and it's not going to affect the camera at all. It just allows you a way to just sort of zoom in to take a closer look at what's going on. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk firstly about some of the differences between the eyebrows and the eyelashes that we've changed once we've gotten into the rendering part. And let's take a look at the eyebrows materials first. So you can see that initially this is what we started with, okay, and it's a good starting point, but I felt like it was a little too sparse, so I wanted to update it. So I just added a little bit more information, and we're still using it as a stencil. The material, I think I darkened it just slightly. Okay, but not too much. But I did want to add a little bit more information just to bring it closer to the concept art. All right, we use the same sort of thing in the eyelashes. This is where we started. Okay, and you can see that it looks good, but it was a little too sparse. So I added a little bit more information. Again, we're still using it as a stencil. So nothing has changed other than we just thickened up from where we started. From there to there. And I think that works a lot nicer. So that's what we're going to go with. So let's pull back a little bit. Just going to unfreeze that preview. Shift scroll wheel down. Gives us our full picture. We can take a look at her shirt material. The other materials, the hair strips, have not been touched. The skin material has not been touched. Really, I just want to point out some of the differences. Now, as you start to add lights and change the intensity of the scene, maybe positioning the lights differently, you're going to need to reevaluate some of the materials and some of the choices that we've already made in the texturing section. And that's just part of the creative and artistic process. So a couple of things that we changed on the outer shirt is that we added displacement map. We changed the color of her shirt a little bit. And this is a sort of relationship. Sometimes you'll alter the color of the diffuse channel. Sometimes you'll alter and change the intensity of the subsurface color. Okay, she's got a pretty good amount of subsurface scattering going on. You just have to use your concept art and preview to get that color dialed in and the intensity. So I felt like with the lighting situation that her shirt was getting blown out a little bit in terms of highlights. So I sort of adjusted these settings just so that I can get a little bit closer in terms of color. Just make sure that the texture is coming through. So I think that these settings work pretty well. Let's have a look at that displacement map. So I'm just going to turn my displacements on so that we can have a look at this little detail. Adding a little bit of detail like this really helps to create a focal point. There's a bit of tension right here where her hand meets her shirt. I'm just going to zoom in on that with my scroll wheel so we can have a little closer look at it. So once you're zoomed in like this, you can just middle mouse drag, okay, and so you can adjust the placement. So we can, if we zoom in a little bit more, you can see that that displacement map is working pretty well here. Okay, it gives a little bit more softness to her shirt. And I think because we have a lot of lines coming into that area, we've added a ring right here, which is a little bit more of a finer detail in terms of just a shape and geometry. So we have a little bit more interest here. We've got some lines coming in from the shirt. You know, we've got a line coming in from her wrist. So there's a lot that's happening, a lot of convergence of lines, and I think it creates a nice little focal point. And that displacement map is real subtle. So it's there, and it's one of those things that if it's there, you don't necessarily notice it, but if it's not there, you might think that something's missing. Anyway, I think that works pretty well in terms of that, just using that displacement map just for a slight little subtle touch. And that's about all that I've done with the outer shirt. Looking at the undershirt, I bumped up a little bit of the color. Let's have a look at that material. Her subsurface color has changed just slightly. Again, you sort of have to evaluate based off of the new or adjusted lighting scenario what that's going to look like, and does that match your concept art. So we've made a little bit of adjustment there. That's about it for the shirt. Alright, so let's have a look at her scarf. Now we've got the area around her neck and then the scarf area around these two little strands coming around the back. So initially we had one material to define both of those. With this lighting situation as it is now, I felt like the materials that we had set up, it was just getting blown out. So I split that material into two parts. So we've got one material that's responsible for her neck, and then I'm just going to compare and contrast these. We still have this mosaic material that's tied to the UV, so that's the same on both, but the materials are slightly different. We've got the same diffuse amount on both. Alright, it's like 45%, but there's a difference in terms of the subsurface amount. These members that come down in the back, we've changed the subsurface amount to 100%, and then up here, just so it absorbs less light, we've turned that subsurface amount down to say 25%. Okay, both still have this transparent effect. You can see a little bit of translucency or transparency in the upper part and the lower part, but the big difference is the subsurface amount. Alright, so the last little bit, we'll take a look at the materials on her dress and on her shoes. And those are the only other two things that had some slight adjustments to them. So I just lowered the diffuse amount a little bit on her dress, just so that we still get the impact of the color, because we've used that material, or that image rather, to represent the subsurface color. It gives us a little bit of a bump with color, but I felt like with the lighting it was getting a little too blown out, so I just lowered down the diffuse amount from 100% down to 80. Regarding her shoes, I just decreased the roughness. We'll have a look at that real quick. Again, it's just really subtle, just a really subtle change to some of the materials. And so I think we were maybe a little bit higher, like 100%, just lowering the roughness down just to create a little bit more of a sheen to it, more of a leathery type look. That basically covers the materials. Like I said, we were kind of ahead of the game when we did our texturing. We have a lot of these things in place, so it's just a matter of making some tweaks, again, to fit our lighting scenario. Now we're going to jump over our render outputs. We're going to come back to those. Let's next just take a look at some of the camera settings. Alright, so let's have a look at our camera. Now the first thing you want to do is make sure your cameras are visible in your viewport. So hit O and then tick the box with Show Cameras. Okay, so let's select it, and then you can see that this is our properties for our camera, but they're grayed out for us because we have our camera locked. Okay, so let's just unlock that temporarily. You can see that my position and rotation channels have been changed, and that's because we've moved the camera around to frame up our shot. Alright, so what I like to do next is to zero out the camera. So just go to 0 and zero all channels. So this gives us a good starting point, just kind of as a fail-safe if we inadvertently move our camera, we can always come back to its 0 position. You can see that our focal length is 60 millimeters or 6 centimeters, and I'm happy with the way that that's framed up our subject, so we're not going to change that. So taking a look at the camera effects, you can see that we have access to a few different things. Depth of field, motion blur, stereoscopic. Now we're not going to use any of these for our project, but should you want to, they're here and available. All you have to do is enable them. Let me just show you one thing with depth of field. I'll occasionally use depth of field, but typically I'm asked to take that character and remove her from the background, put her on a different background. I like to have that sort of flexibility. And if I have depth of field turned on, I have a blurred edge that I have to deal with. So I typically will turn that off. And any sort of blurring that I need to have happen, I'll always do in post. Okay, so it's very rare that I'll actually use that depth of field, but it's there and it's available. Let me just show you how you use it. So if you have your camera selected and you hit the Y key, you have this widget that pops up. This little blue square, you'll just move it back and forth just to get where you want to be in focus. Okay, that's what I want to be in focus, in line. You see that camera line. And then you can just set your f-stop accordingly. Alright, so a small depth of field or a large depth of field. Alright, so that's up to you. Alright, so let's turn off depth of field and we're going to lock our camera again. Let's talk about the render region tool. So the render region tool is a great tool to use when you're wanting to focus in on an area and not have to render the entire scene. Say that you're happy with her lower body, but you really want to say focus on her eyes or on her hair or something, some detail of the model. Well, you'd use a render region tool for a really quick workflow. Let me show you how to set that up. So the first thing we'll do is change our viewport from perspective to camera. So Control Spacebar, go to Camera. And then we'll go under Render to Render Region Tool. Okay, let's just say that we want to focus in just on her hand. Okay, I'm just going to draw out a little box. And that box is going to stay there. If you see, if you click on the render node, you can see that that box is ticked. Okay, so if you hit F9, you're just going to get a render of just that hand. Okay, so that's typically what I'll do. I'll set the render region tool. If I wanted to say I'm happy with that, maybe I'll just move down to this hand. I'll draw another box, do some renders, get it looking right. Then I'll move up here, say maybe her eyes, or you can just reposition that, say just that eye or both eyes, whatever the case is. So you can redo that, and then when you're done using the render region tool, make sure that you untick that and the entire scene will render again for you. So using the render region tool really speeds up your workflow quite a bit, allows you to quickly focus on an area to get it right. It's just a really quick workflow. So let's have a look at some of our render settings. So come over here to frame, and you can see under the frame we've got our resolution that's set, and we can scale this up or down. But if you double click on that, you can put in whatever you want. So if you're doing test renders, you might want to lower that down. Let's just go with say maybe 1500. Okay, and it will proportionally scale your scene for you. Okay, so just make sure that you click that twice, you get that little icon. Let's just come back up to 3200. So let's check out the settings. Now the scope of this tutorial won't allow us to get into everything here, but I'm going to share with you a recipe that I've had a lot of success with when rendering characters that are similar to this. So up at the top, my anti-aliasing, you can see it's set to 64 samples, and that's largely because when I was doing some test rendering, I noticed some noise in her hair that I didn't like, and also a little bit of noise in her clothing. Alright, so raising that anti-aliasing up to 64 samples was a good enough number to eliminate that noise. Now I always use this Catmull ROM anti-aliasing filter. I set my environment shading to 0.1 pixels and my refinement shading rate to 0.25 pixels. My refinement threshold, I usually keep at 5%. Now these settings I use for a typical final render, but if I'm doing test rendering, then I'll make some adjustments. I'll make this to, say, change this to 1, and then I might change my refinement rate to no refinement. And if I needed just a little bit more speed, that usually helps with that. So I make sure that I always have adaptive subdivision turned on, and at the default 10 pixels for my subdivision rate, I've just found that to be a good number to use. Now if I'm zoomed into a particular area, or if I see any sort of faceting around the edges, then I'll lower this rate of my subdivision rate. I'll lower it to something, half of that or maybe a quarter of that, just so that faceting is smoothed out. So let's have a look at global illumination. We know that we have subsurface scattering on. It's set to both, and I typically will always use both. Under irradiance caching, my irradiance raise I bumped up from the default of 256 up to 1024. Okay, because we have a lot of nice shadow area down here, and that really helps to smooth things out. So the last thing we'll look at is our render outputs and how we might use them in post-production. So I don't use a wide variety of render outputs, but the ones that I do use have a specific purpose. So I'll show you the ones that I use, and we'll talk about how I use them in post-production work. With every Modo scene, you start off with two render outputs. You have a final color output, which is selected. You can see that its output gamma is set to 2.2, and then you're also given an alpha output. Now there are of course a number of different outputs available to you. Let me just show you them. So if I have an output up here, I can right click in the effect column and you can see the number of different outputs available to us. Now the only other one that I use all the time is this surface ID output, and if I change my preview to reflect that surface ID output, then I'll just unpause. You can see what I get. So what the surface ID output does for us is that each material mask that we've assigned to our subject is represented in its own unique color. So in post-production work, this is a really quick way to come in and isolate with, say, the magic wand tool if we wanted to change the color of her shirt or her dress or her bag, anything like that, we can quickly, with the magic wand tool, select it, do an edit, whether it's color, hue, saturation, value, anything like that. So it's a really good render output to have. So the next render output I want to talk about is the alpha output. So I'm just going to change my preview to show me that. And you can see that that material that was on the ground has gone away. If I'm going to clip her out of the background, I don't want that ground in there. All right, I want to be able just to have her all by herself. So that's set up a little bit differently. Let's talk about that. So in the shader tree, you can see that we've got an alpha channel and it's inside of a group. Well, the reason that we do that is because this group allows us to mask on whatever item that we want. We can mask on a group, we can mask on an individual geometry layer if we wanted. So we're masking on this character group. And you can see if I twirl this up or down that inside of this character group we've got handbag, girl, and scarf. And those are all three separate geometry layers. So if we change this group from masking on character to say just masking on the girl, you can see as preview updates that the bag will go away and that her scarf will go away, because now the group is not targeting that character item anymore, it's only targeting the girl. And we can accomplish that through using a group with an alpha channel inside it. Okay, so let's recreate this. Now I've got the preview paused, and we're just going to leave that in place. First thing I want to do is to create a group. So go to Add Layer, Create Group, and then I'm just going to relabel that as Character Demo. Okay, and that's going to contain our alpha. Now the best way to create an additional render output is to select one that's in the scene already, right click, and duplicate. Now that's going to come in as an exact copy of it. Now just in the effects column, we're going to change that from surface ID, just right click, and we'll go to alpha. And then let's relabel that. And we'll call this Demo Alpha. Now then we're going to drag that into our group, our character demo group. Now there it is. We're going to select our group, and then we're going to tell it what to target. All right, so let's go and let's just target that character item group, which is up here. So that if we go to preview now, click on that and go to Demo Alpha, and then we'll unpause this. You can see that we'll have the three geometry layers that are in our character group populate in our alpha. So we'll have the handbag, we'll have the girl, and then we'll have the scarf, because they're all contained within that character group. So that's how we would mask on a group. You can also mask on an individual geometry layer by selecting it just like that, or you could mask on an individual material mask, one of the materials that we've assigned to our model. All right, so let's do that. So with our preview paused, I'm just going to, let's just mask out the legs. So I'm just going to grab that alpha, just going to drop it into her legs material mask down here. So when I unpause, you can see that we've got a really clean alpha that's just on her legs. Now you can do that, of course, all the way up and down your shader tree item, just depending on what you want. So now with our settings in place, all we have left to do is to do a render. So let's do that. Hit F9 and we're off and running. So a cup of coffee and just shy of 13 minutes, we've got our final render. Now we also have, in addition to our final color output, we've rendered our different render outputs. So you can see our surface ID output, and then you can see our alpha output. If you hit the space bar, it'll maximize that window should you need that. So now we're ready to save out our file. So we're going to save out a layered file, but if I'm doing test renders, what I'll do is typically just save out just a JPEG image. So you just click on Save Image and it'll give you a few different options. But if we want to save out a layered file, just click and hold, go to Saved Layered Image. Alright, we're going to call this Final Render. You can see I've already done that. So we'll save it, we'll replace it. Yes sir, we want to replace it. Alright, so now we can bring this over into Photoshop and just have a final pass at it and see if there are any sort of tweaks that we need to make to it. Alright, so here we are in Photoshop. We've got our render open and things are looking pretty good. What I like to do next is just do a final evaluation of everything, just from top to bottom, just to see if there are any tweaks that we want to make. So I like to put my art director hat on at this point and just sort of be really objective to see if anything sort of jumps out at me. And there are a couple things I'll just bring your attention to. First of all, we could leave it like this and I think it would be just fine, but just to take it a little bit further adds a little bit of spit polish to an image that can really make a lot of difference in my opinion. So a couple things that I would change with this render is you can see that there's a little bit of weirdness going on with some of those hair strands, and we can take that out pretty easily. Maybe over here too, and then there. And then we might want to add a couple of strands of hair just to soften up these little shapes to make them just a little bit softer. Okay, so I'll just put those notes in. Maybe we can cheat that a little bit up here to make it, a couple of extra strands coming off of the head like that, just to sort of soften it up a little bit. I'm pretty happy with the rest of the hair and how that's looking. So there's no noise. We've eliminated that by raising our anti-aliasing and adjusting to our settings to make them a little bit finer. There's no noise in the rest of the body here, which is really nice. This little rim light around here is working really well for us to help define that edge, so I like that a lot. I might want to warm up her fingers. You see as the light's coming in here and hitting those fingers, I might want to celebrate that a little bit more, add a little bit more warmth to that, just to that little section right there. And her arm might be a little bit dark. Okay, it's kind of a subjective thing at that point, but we can brighten that up a little bit, add a little bit of warmth maybe to that hand, and bring that closer in line with the warmth of her skin. Just something subtle. Okay. Her feet look really good. I'm very happy with this shadow down here. It's a real subtle thing, but it's all very clean. There's no pixelating, there's no splotchiness, so that's working really well. Let's just talk about some of the final color outputs that we have in place. I'm just going to restack everything. Now typically I'll bring this surface ID up to the top of the stack so that it's easier to select. So if I have that layer selected, and I can select really easily with the magic wand tool, okay, then come back down to this layer. I can create an adjustment layer and adjust the color very easily. Alright, so that's how I'll typically work with that. Just move that surface ID output on top. Now if I need to clip her out of the background, say put her on a different background, then what I'll do is I'll select that alpha output, I'll select all, and then I'll copy it, come up here to my final color output, and then I'll create a mask. I'll option click that and then just paste it, then come back here. Now she's clipped out. Okay, so she's on that transparent background, so that if I wanted to create another layer back here, let's just say like a darker pink or something like that, and then just fill that. Okay, that's successfully done, and we'd paint that shadow back under it. Okay, so that's typically how I'd use those final color outputs to accomplish what I want to accomplish with the image. Alright, so with those notes applied, I think I'm ready to start just with a little bit of paint over, just a little touch up that we mentioned. So I'm just going to select that and just disable that layer mask for the time being, and then just start with a few of those little adjustments. Okay, so with just a few more minutes of work, and literally just like 10-15 minutes maybe, we've got a little bit softer, a little bit nicer final image. So let's deconstruct this just real quickly and see just compare and contrast with where we started and then where we're at. Okay, so I'm just going to turn all this off. You can see this is where we started. Now the first thing that I did was just to raise a little bit of the contrast by creating a curves layer. Okay, you can see I just wanted to bump up the value just a touch, deepen the shadows just slightly, but mostly just to sort of make her a little bit brighter. Sort of a small change. Now the next thing, just come up a little bit closer to the face. As I adjusted her eye, just the pupils, you can see I just made them slightly darker. Just a little bit of a touch there. Alright? And then I made those pupils darker, and I also made her highlights in her eyes just a touch whiter. You can see how very subtle and small it is. Okay, but if you put a lot of these small details together, I think you get a lot of really a big payoff in the end. Let's look at her skin next. You can see on her nose right here, that little bit of a rim light. Now it's there, but we can celebrate that a little bit more by adding a little bit of subtle value. You can see that in her neck, I introduced a little bit of this color. I picked up this color from her scarf just to add a little bit of color into her neck. That's a really subtle thing, but it's there. And then coming down to her hands and her arm over here, if I turn the skin off, you can see the value shift there. So those little fingers pop out a little bit more. Okay, the light's there. Again, it's just sort of tweaking. This was a little bit warmer. Now this is an overlay layer. Okay, so it's making the highlights brighter and more saturated, just like it makes the shadows darker and more saturated. Okay, so you can see also that I picked up a little bit of pink to brighten up and introduce a little bit more color into her forearm that's in a shadow there. Again, just sort of a soft touch, but the shadows have a little bit more color in them, a little bit more life. Let's look at this arm, this hand. Same sort of thing. Just bumped up the value a little bit, made that a little bit warmer. I also introduced some color in the shadow right here, and it's just I sort of sampled this flower, this little coral color flower. You can see that subtle change, that little color right there. I think that works pretty well for us. Then moving up to her hair, let's turn that on. You can see that we've softened up these little parts, and this is just real subtle, but it serves to just again sort of soften the profile a little bit, soften the silhouette, just cheat that just a little bit up here slightly, just a couple of little strands here and there to do that. And we filled in over here too, put some random really thin strokes, and it just enhances what we already have. Okay, it gets rid of some of this noise in here, some of this, but we leave a little bit of it just for effect. You can see it's just a real subtle touch. And then I've got a freckles layer. Now in the concept art we've got some freckles on our subject, and I think that's just sort of playful, so I just put those back in, and that's just that layer set to multiply just with like a darker brown or color. And I've created another couple of layers of freckles. You can see that just it's sort of working in a way that's just very natural. So that if we zoom out to 100%, you can see that these details aren't overwhelming. They just serve to sort of enhance our final image. Alright, I think that wraps it up. This is our final image of the project.